The Utah Jazz finally strikes gold. Lottery riches. Let's talk about it.
Jazz Smack, NBA and Utah Jazz basketball.
So after years of tanking and watching the Jazz just go through throwing games, purposely losing, they finally got this to a point where they end up with that number 2 draft pick in a really deep draft, a top-heavy draft, a good draft where they have an opportunity to get the player that can elevate them to hopefully title status, a franchise-type player. That's what they've been searching for, and this, finally, they get some luck. They get the number 2 selection. So from here, this very exciting point, what do the Jazz do? What do they do with their newfound riches, their newfound luck? And a number of different things can take place here. And I fully believe that the Ainges, both Danny, Justin, Zanuck, and Austin Ainge, are going to field offers. They're not gonna say with certainty, okay, we're just gonna make this number 2 pick. They're gonna field offers and see what other teams are willing to give for that number 2 pick. Now, are the Jazz in a situation where they are willing to go from number 2 to number 10 or number 8? No, I definitely do not believe the Jazz would even consider doing that. The Jazz know they have to get this right. They must get that franchise guy with this pick. In my opinion, that guy is not currently on the roster. I don't think that top 10 player that can carry you to a title, that you can put the franchise on that person's back, I don't think that guy is on the roster right now. I think they have a capability of having some. I think Ace can be a really important part of that, but I don't think he's that guy. I think the Jazz need to get that guy in this year's draft. So are the Jazz willing to trade out of number 2 to number 8 or 10 or 7 and pick up other assets in that process and then select at number 7? No. I just don't foresee that happening. I don't think they're willing to take that chance. I think they see an opportunity here to maybe pick up additional assets and still get the guy they want. That's a possibility, like the Angels have done in the past with the Tatum selection. That's the type of scenario I see. They're not going to go trade way back in the draft. They've got to pick high, and they have to get it right. Maybe they move down to number 4, but quite frankly, I'd be shocked if they moved down further than that. At most, maybe to the number 4 pick, if the guy they really want is available at number 4, but they're not going to move down to 7. There's just way too much uncertainty. Even if they think that the number 7 guy is as good as the guy they can get it to, there's so much uncertainty between number 2 and number 7 of who's selected. There's way too much variability in this for them to do that. I think they'll move down a spot or 2 if it presents themselves with another, with asset value. They're just trying to maximize assets still. They're still trying to maximize assets. The most likely scenario is they make the selection number 2. The next most likely scenario is they trade down and pick up other assets. The least likely scenario is they move up from number 2 to number 1. That's the least likely, in my opinion, the way I read it right now. But it would be a dereliction of duty on both the Ainges and Zanuck on their parts to not field offers for that number 2 selection. It would be an absolute gross negligence on their part. So they're definitely going to do that. Do the Jazz know what they're going to do right now? No, the Jazz don't know what they're going to do. They're in the beginning stages of this process. They're going to evaluate all these guys. They've already been evaluating these guys. They're going to do further evaluations. They're going to bring a bunch of guys in for workouts. They're going to go through that whole process. Most likely, they make the number 2 selection. So that brings us to the next point. So what are the top draft? According to like a number of sources, these are the top 5 selections right now. Are these going to be the top 5 selections? Yeah, that's up in the air too. It depends on what the team's selecting. If in the final draft order, what trades are made. There's a bunch of components that into this. But right now, D. Bonsa, the number 1, and then Darren Peterson, number 2. Now, when I'm looking at this data, I look at this and I go, okay, of these 5 guys here, the only one that has point guard next to his name, point guard / shooting guard, a combo guard, is Darren Peterson at the number 2 selection. Yet you look over here at these assist numbers. Out of these 5 guys, Darren Peterson averaged the least amount of assists by a lot of all 5 of these guys, yet he's the only one, the point guard, listed next to his name. So I've not watched Darren Peterson play extensively this year. I've seen a little bit. 24 games played, that's somewhat alarming, that 24 games played, because he did not have any major injuries this year. It's not like Caleb Wilson, who had a significant injury, didn't finish the year, and played only 24 games. Darren Peterson, he played in 24 games, and he did not even complete those 24 games because he exited mid-game in one or more games. I think it was multiple games where he just did not complete the game. Now, in recent... So that is alarming. We know that about Peterson, that he sat a lot this year. There's been recently some reports made about the creatine thing, where he was receiving like creatine supplements and he had way too much creatine in his body, and it was causing cramping issues. Now, and it was as a result of, the University of Kansas, the training staff, the medical staff, whatever, telling Peterson that he needed to take this creatine. That's been that's the report that's out there right now. Now, how much validity is there to that report? How much truth is there? I don't know. And I don't think that anybody knows with certainty, including the 30 NBA teams. Because, quite frankly, was Peterson taking creatine supplements? Possibly. Was Kansas the one telling him that he needed to take these creatine supplements? It could possibly be true. It could also be true that Peterson himself was choosing to take creatine supplements, and he was causing his own problems, even though the blame is now being placed at the hands of the Kansas, the University of Kansas and the training staff. So you just don't know for sure where this is coming from. I mean, it may be that Peterson was not taking supplements at all, and this is just completely all false information. You just never know. And so this brings us back to another portion of this, in this whole player evaluation thing, that is there's just so many unknowns. There's so much false information. There's true information. We saw this last draft with the Ace Bailey thing, where there were always all these reports. He had people in his camp and not letting him go to certain places. All these teams were told, he's not going to play for you. He only wants to play here, and he doesn't want to play anywhere else. And there are all these things about his character and attitude and everything. And then we find out after the draft, we draft him after the draft, and we find out that he's an absolutely terrific kid. Awesome kid, and all that stuff about his character and everything, all that was just complete nonsense. Absolutely all of it was false. It was just lie after lie after lie. He's an awesome kid, and we, quite frankly, from an attitude standpoint, we couldn't have lucked into a better kid. He's that good. And we're in an awesome situation with Ace. So The information out there is oftentimes false, and there's a lot of incentives for it to be false. Trying to elevate this guy to be drafted as high as possible, or being routed to, certain places, information out there by an agent or one of his reps or something like that, where the player himself really doesn't have anything to do with that. So this takes us back to something that happened in the Jazz past with a past player. And that player, his name was Luther Wright. Now, the Jazz drafted Luther Wright in the 1993 NBA draft out of Seton Hall, the 18th pick. At the time, in post-draft, there were reports that his coach, who was PJ Carlesimo, yes, that PJ Carlesimo, who's now a basketball announcer, analyst, who was famously the coach at Golden State Warriors, and Latrell Sprewell tried to coach him out tried to basically choke him out during a practice. And that was a huge, obviously, one of the big stories of the past 25 years in terms of a player-coach relationship. But that PJ Carlesimo, he was the coach of Luther Wright at Seton Hall in 1993. And it was reported after the fact that he gave the Utah Jazz a glowing report on Luther Wright, the person and player. And then the Jazz draft him, just this massive individual, 7'2", just a huge, huge person. Physically just monstrous individual. But the Utah Jazz were a good team. Luther Wright didn't get a ton of playing time, spot minutes, spot development minutes. But quite frankly, it was discovered that Luther Wright had some significant character issues, substantial character issues. During that season, Luther Wright was discovered at a rest stop off of I-80 by Tooele at like 4 a.m. with like a baseball bat or a 2x4, and he was threatening weary motorists out at that rest stop. He was arrested, and that one season with the Utah Jazz was it. That was it. He had mental health problems. He was gone. He was out of the franchise. So PJ Carlesimo just blatantly, flat out lied to the Utah Jazz. And there was incentive for him to do that. I fully believe he lied to the Utah Jazz. Luther Wright was probably a problem for him at Seton Hall. He realized that. He knew that. He wanted Luther out of his program. He wanted to just move on. So he did so any way possible, get him drafted in the NBA. He's off of Seton Hall. He's out of, he's just, there are no more worries from Carlesimo's standpoint with Luther. There's also incentive from PJ Carlesimo or any other college coach to get guys drafted in the first round, because that's a recruiting tool for other NBA prospects or other college prospects. Like, you can say, okay, as a college coach, well, we just got this guy drafted in the first round. That's a recruiting tool. So there's incentives for false information to end up in the hands of these NBA franchises. And there's always going to be false information out there. False information from coaches, past coaches, people around these players. There's just lots of information that needs to be filtered through. And you try and filter out the false stuff and get to a point where you where you think you understand a player. But there are no certainties. It's a crapshoot. It'll always be a crapshoot. You just don't know for sure. So those are two, that's a situation that happened in the past with the Utah Jazz. The Jazz want to avoid that. The information today is certainly better because each of these NBA franchises has far more resources they can dedicate to looking into these players' past and seeing what type of players, what people they are, what type of players they are. There are far more resources today than there were 30 years ago available to each of these franchises. But there's still no certainties. Unless you're there with the player day in and day out, see him in all those different types of scenarios, both on the court, off the court, you just don't know. And obviously the health aspect plays into this as well. A player needs to have good health. So what do the Jazz want out of this? When it's all said and done, and you go back 15 years, and you look at the careers of all these different guys who are going to be drafted, considering the Jazz select at that number 2 position, what the hope is for the Jazz is they select the player out of this draft with at worst has the second best career. And that doesn't matter if you're drafting at number 2 or you end up drafting at number 4 by trading down and getting other draft assets. The Jazz need to attempt to get the first or second best player in the draft in terms of career accomplishments. That has to be the goal, considering they have the number 2 selection right now. We'll see what happens. It's going to be interesting. We're going to take a look at some of these players more thoroughly, in the lead up to the draft. But it's just an absolutely exciting time for the Jazz right now because they finally have an opportunity to really swing things in a different direction. They are going to be a lot better next year, and now with this, the number 2 pick, it's going to elevate next year's the excitement going into next season even more, and it should make Summer League, both in Salt Lake and Vegas, even more interesting. Having that type of a selection, playing in Summer League, wow, it's going to be great. Hopefully Ace is able to play in Summer League as well, both in Salt Lake, and I hope the Jazz take him to Vegas too. That would make Summer League so much better. I love Summer League. I think in a lot of ways, especially considering where the Jazz have been, trying to lose games, trying to tank for draft position, these last few seasons, it has made Summer League that much more important, that much more interesting, because a lot of those games later in the season, later in the NBA regular season, are not very interesting. The Jazz are trying to lose. Summer League is one of the high points. I certainly, with both Ace and the draft selection, this Summer League should be great. It should be great in Salt Lake. It should be great in Vegas, and certainly looking forward to that. So we have, as a fan base, there's a lot to look forward to in the coming months until the start of next season. And next season should be great because the Jazz should certainly be in the playoffs, in the postseason next year, playing postseason games. Now, do I expect the Jazz to win a title next year? No. There's still a building process. None of these guys, Lowry has still never played in a playoff game. Anybody they draft is not going to be playing a playoff game, obviously. Ace has never played in a playoff game. Keontae's never played in a playoff game. None of these guys have played in the playoffs other than Jackson. These guys have not any of the major people that the Jazz are going to be, any of the major players the Jazz are going to be counting on to take them into the playoffs. Jaren Jackson's the only guy that's played in the playoffs. The Jazz have some growing pains still left to do, but that's going to be part of the process. But boy, with the changes the NBA are going to make with the lottery and how that works and the incentives for tanking to be gone and the improved roster of the Jazz, next year should be a lot more interesting for all involved. And following the Jazz next year should be vastly more entertaining. And we are all looking forward to seeing that. So with that being said, I think we're going to call it quits for this edition of Jazz Smack, and we will talk to everybody very soon.